Welcome to Way Over Our Heads, a climate and weather podcast. I'm Jim Dubois. Kenny Blumenfeld is a climatologist. Kenny, how you doing?
Oh, it's the end of the weekend after Thanksgiving, so tired. Oddly looking forward to getting back to the grind of work. Also really thankful for having my family around and probably gained a few pounds, but it was a good time. You had a good weekend, Jim?
It was fabulous, yes. Ate way too much, but did had a chance to enjoy some of the nice weather. Had a great walk on Thanksgiving Day.
Yeah, you could actually do that this year on Thanksgiving.
It was very pleasant.
We've had our years where you couldn't do that. This was a decent one as Thanksgivings go. Well, nothing too unusual about it. I mean, it was above freezing. There was no precipitation in the area, and the whole region stayed sane until the end of the weekend when parts of southern Iowa and northern Illinois and far southern Wisconsin kind of took a beating. But
now we dodged that bullet.
Yeah, we did. We didn't know we were going to. Maybe 5 days ago, it looked like we were going to get hit pretty good, but this thing always sort of had its eye on Chicago and maybe Milwaukee. And those are the same systems. You know, it's a low pressure system. And if it turns a little bit farther north, then we get it. But this one, pretty well behaved past, basically, if the center of the low pressure passes over Missouri and it sort of goes from Kansas City to just north of St. Louis, that's usually too far south to give us much. You need a really distended, kind of deformed system to produce snow or inclement weather for us if the center is that far south. We like them more, Jim, we like them more in the Des Moines to La Crosse. If the low pressure area goes from, say, Omaha to Des Moines and maybe into southern Wisconsin near La Crosse, that's kind of got our number. That's sort of what we're looking for. So yeah, this one was just a little too far.
Well, what does the weather look like for, say, the end of November and early December? Are we going to see a cooling trend here and then maybe another warm-up?
Yeah, so, I mean, it looks like we're going to, be cold at the beginning of the week. Of course, I don't know when anyone's going to really hear this, so we're talking about the final week of November. We're going to finish November really cold. I mean, the month was already cold, and we're going to finish November mostly that way. Even if we warm up a bit, no one's going to go, wow, November was hot, because it wasn't. And the first part of December will be, it keeps looking like we're going to switch into this mild pattern. And exactly when that begins is still a little bit fuzzy, but sometime during the first week of December, that kind of looks like that point we stop flirting with the really cold air and start getting into a mild pattern. There's a lot of, probably more time than we have that I could put asterisks on the end of what I just said, though, Jim. It's not, this stuff, if you know anything about, talking to me and following the weather yourself, some of these things, they're really beyond our ability to grasp them. And when we talk about long-range forecasting, we think we got it, and then something comes along and says, nope, no, you don't. And I'm not exactly sure what it is this year, Jim, but we've sort of seen this really shiny advertisement of warmer weather, and it's always been about 10 days away. But it hasn't moved much beyond 10 days away, even as those supposed times have come and gone. So, but it still looks like December is going to probably be mild on balance if we can actually flip into that mild pattern.
Well, the day after Thanksgiving, a climate report came out, the National Climate Assessment that I believe comes out annually, and it had some pretty dire predictions.
Yeah, so this is actually not annually. The report is generated basically in regular intervals. It's mandated by Congress, and it'll come out every 4 years or so. So the last one was in 2014. And the review process for the next one will probably begin next year and will carry us a couple years. And this is a mandated assessment of the climate system as part of the Global Change Research Program. It's also kind of a federal initiative. There's not really any money for this, but Congress says we shall do this. So basically, an assessment team is assembled. They're scientists and practitioners in the field. And this kind of mimics what happens at the global scale with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, with the main difference being this one's really focused on the United States. It does a good job of teasing out how we have interdependencies with the global climate. So you can't just cut the United States out from the rest of the world and deal with this completely in isolation. It does deal with some of those interdependencies, but at the same time, its focus is really on what's going to happen in the United States and maybe in some cases more broadly North America, but it's generally United States focused.
Well, it did cite some predictions for the Midwest that are quite dire, one of which impacts the agricultural industry, and we're talking about perhaps reduced yields and more drought, and ironically more moisture as well, which could cause problems.
Yeah, and there's also a sense that we're already starting to see some of those impacts. Now, it's important for us to remember science is a framework for understanding life. It's a framework for understanding reality. And it's a really good framework in that you have a bunch of experts who conduct research and they submit papers, and then the other experts read the papers and react to them before the papers are actually published. So it goes through this peer review. It's very rigorous, but one of the beautiful things about science and also one of the frustrating things about it is you never fully figure it all out because there's always something else to learn. And so we have to caution people, this is an assessment of the state of the science. It is what we know now. And what we know, of course, is sort of bounded by the limitations that we bring into what we know and includes what we don't know. No two reports have ever been identical. So the one that was released in 2014 has some differences. The one that was released this year and also last year is it broke into two separate volumes. And the first volume was general climate trends and projections. And it was basically telling us, okay, here's where the climate's been going in the United States and in the Midwest. And then, and here's where it looks like it's going to continue to go based on some of our modeling. Now, we're just talking about the climate. That was volume 1, much of which was released in 2017. The version that we have now is volume 2, and it really deals with, let's not just talk about the climate and the weather. Let's instead talk about what are the results of the climate and the weather acting on us with our humanized systems and the ecosystems and natural systems that we depend on and manage. What's going to happen with that? And here in the upper Midwest, we are a major agricultural producer. Yeah, some of the outlooks aren't so rosy, especially in parts of the Corn Belt. So far, the genetic improvements that big agriculture has been able to make have been able to offset changes in the climate system. But you can't deny that it's getting warmer and that it's also been getting wetter, and that the way that the precipitation has been distributed has been a little bit more chaotic, and it's predisposed parts of the region anyway to drought in between wet periods. So agriculture looks to be an increasing concern as we get warmer and potentially hotter in the future.
Another issue, too, is infrastructure. With warmer temperatures, of course, the atmosphere can hold more moisture. That means more intense rainfalls. And I believe the report was talking about something to the effect of $500 million to update the Midwest storm sewer system, for example, to accommodate all this additional precipitation?
Yeah, some of the, I have to admit, some of the figures that they used, I'm not sure where they came from. Updating all of the storm sewers in the upper Midwest would be well north of that value.
You would think so, yeah.
Yeah, it would be a lot more. And I would say this is an area where we have a lot to learn, and the scientists who were involved in the assessment did their very best to get at some of these resources. But for example, what they're talking about is if you get a rainfall that exceeds the design capacity of, say, your storm sewers or of culverts, of anything that's meant to sort of convey water from one area to another, if it exceeds the capacity of those structures to do their job, then the water instead goes into the ground and can overwhelm the surfaces and overwhelm the ground, and you end up with bridge failures. You can end up with slope failures or landslides.
Roads being undermined.
You can end up with roads buckling or being undermined, and this is what you see whenever you get one of those really big rainfall events. One of the things I'm curious about is why some of the figures seem so low. And this isn't to be alarmist. It's just that when the hospital near the University of Minnesota, when the hill in front of it collapsed in June of 2014, that very small area, it was just about an acre or two. I mean, it was a really small area. That was several $1 million to fix that.
Right.
So the notion that we could somehow address all of the needs of the existing and coming climate by adding a couple zeros seems a little curious to me. But again, this is not like that information is easy to obtain either. You really have to get at it. It's difficult.
Well, the researchers did give themselves a little wiggle room here. It says that the retrofitting of urban stormwater systems, the cost will exceed $500 million for the Midwest by the end of the century. So they gave themselves, obviously, a lot of leeway beyond that $500 million figure.
Yeah. It's going to, I think what we know is it's going to cost a lot. And doing it, there's, you have to want to do it. And this is a whole other issue. There has to be the money. You have to have the money to do it. You have to have the will to do it. And you have to have a way to do it. And those things don't always align. So this is just one piece of it. This is saying, oh, by the way, here's what we could be facing. And that doesn't mean that the solution is forthcoming. As we know, people point out problems all the time, and that doesn't mean that we all go and fix them. So it'll be interesting, but it is a pretty critical situation. One of the things that this report does is it focuses on, and readers may have heard of, these different scenarios, or listeners, I'm sorry, may know of these different scenarios that you can build projections on. And they basically are scenarios that take into account different amounts of greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere. So you have a lower emissions scenario and a higher emissions scenario. And one of the things that this report did was it showed what some of the differences would be if we follow the lower emissions scenario versus the higher emissions scenario. Now, unfortunately, the higher emissions scenario is one that's very similar to what we're already doing. Even with the current savings and cuts that we've made recently, we're still sort of on the path to come in near the higher end of that range. And so we would need to make changes because that higher emission scenario it's hotter, it's droughtier, it's stormier, at least in between dry periods, and it's just in general worse and harder to cope with. There is some emphasis in that report on, the benefits of making it to the lower emissions scenario, what we call RCP 4.5, as opposed to 8.5.
Well, the report also indicated that air quality will suffer and ozone levels may increase. People with asthma and others who have respiratory difficulties will be the most vulnerable to this. This is obviously another big area of concern.
Yeah, departments of health have started to really get concerned in the last few years, especially about degraded air quality, not just from the particulates that are in the air because of human activity, but also from things like upwind, forest fires, and wildfires. And remember, we often think of fire, it is natural, it occurs somewhat regularly on the landscape, but when the smoke floats downstream, you inhale pieces of everything that was on fire. It's not just trees and shrubs and brush and vegetation. It also includes if there were houses, if there were chemicals that combusted, all kinds of things get caught up in that smoke. So the direct pollution from that, the particulates that are part of just, living in a modern world, and then also even health professionals have become concerned with increased pollen because the growing season and the allergy seasons are increasing in duration. So yeah, there's a lot there in terms of human impact. And, I think we've talked about this before. Minnesota's an area that'll have some direct impacts, as we get bigger storms. But a lot of the impacts that we experience are going to be secondary. They're going to be because the growing season changes what can grow here. And so we have altered ecosystems and we have new vegetation that invades or new species that invade and kind of change the way business is done in the natural world.
Well, the National Climate Assessment, which came out the day after Thanksgiving, does paint a very dire picture of the changing climate, indicates that the time for dilly-dallying, shall we say, has gone by the wayside, very much like the IPCC report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that was released by the UN back in October. What can we do, Kenny, to instill in people the fact that we don't have a lot of time to make these changes that are necessary to prevent potentially a climatic catastrophe?
Yeah, this is a tough question, Jim. I can't even pretend I have the answer to that. We know from the last 2 decades that people screaming from rooftops hasn't really helped all that much. It's in fact maybe increased some divisions. People don't like being yelled at and told, like, you have to do something. And then, some smart communicators have tried switching that around and making more of a we must act. I have to say, since I'm not working for my employer right now, I can say I'm surprised at how easily complacency comes. I mean, complacency comes very easily to people. We're just like, oh, we don't need to worry. It's not as big a deal as these experts say it is. In reality, I think if you really dive into, on one hand, you could say, sure, there's some uncertainty in some of these models, and sure, there's some things we still don't know. But even when you account for all of that, everything points to a massively changing climate system. We're talking about huge changes. And to change the climate system on the scale that we expect it to change, there are going to have to be ensuing changes in the systems that depend on the climate. So we're talking about major ecological change, major changes in what lives on the land, changes in what can grow where, changes in what you can do when you're outside. I mean, if we lose, for example, our ice cover season dramatically in Minnesota, that changes economic opportunities and it also changes recreational opportunities. And that's probably the most benign of the changes. How to make people care? I mean, that's a whole other line of work. And I would say the people in that line of work haven't figured that one out either. I don't know. What do you think, Jim? I mean, you've been in communications for your whole life.
A long time.
So what do you think?
Well, it's interesting how this issue has become so politicized. To your point, I mean, it's such a complicated question about how to get people to take the concept of climate change seriously. But one of the first things I think has to be a trust in experts. I mean, we've seen almost this climate, to use a term, where scientists are becoming suspect, where experts are being, I would say, marginalized. And, we have a lot of people who have a very, very poor understanding of how climate works and how weather works. And, our own president tweeted, look at this cold snap on the East Coast, so much for global warming. What does that say? And when people don't understand even the most basic rudimentary science, it's very hard to get them very excited about the dire consequences that this may all bring. So I don't know. I'd love to see it depoliticized. I don't know how that happens. I have confidence in younger people. I think there's some strong indications that younger people.
Put a lot of pressure on those young people, though.
Yeah, we do.
I just heard one of them. Oh, it was great. Someone said basically, yeah, we keep hearing that we're the answer, and then we go and take classes with the best professors, and we go and get the best ideas, and then they tell us, now you figure it out.
We are putting a lot of pressure on young people, aren't we?
And,
after we've damaged the climate, so now it's up to them to fix it.
And I think they rightly have a sense of, well, don't just hand it to us. Like, give us a smooth transition there. And yeah, it's not, I mean, we talk about depoliticizing it. And for me, in conversation with people, that comes really easily. That's something I have no problem doing. But that's also part of my job, is to talk about what's going on with the climate in a way that's as neutral as possible and without being scientifically dishonest. And I have a passion for communication, and I've always enjoyed talking about the weather and the climate. And so it comes pretty easily to me to do that. But I think it's a lot to ask someone to do the same thing when they are completely personally invested in, this is the correct answer and you have to hear me. And this is, this is head-bangingly urgent issue. And I don't know what the solution is to that. I mean, one of the real curses of the world that we've developed with the communications is that there's so much information out there and there's so much opportunity to add to that information that I think we've sort of lost our ability to filter this whole phenomenon with fake news. I mean, I could have told you from the weather community, we saw this coming 15 years ago because you had platforms that made it impossible to distinguish expert from non-expert information. Who's a real forecaster and who's not a real forecaster? Who's the trusted expert in a community? Is it the person who's got lots of experience doing this, or is it the person with a louder megaphone? The internet has provided us with these megaphones, and part of the issue now is that there's so much noise out there. I think people have a hard time understanding what to make of it. And that puts us in a really frustrating situation because, again, I don't know all of the answers, but I do have a really good sense of what the correct information to be paying attention to is. And it is frustrating to be competing with completely illegitimate information or information where, you know what, oh, this person who disagrees has a good point, but the amount of weight that good point is given is way outsized compared to what its true relevance is. It puts us in a difficult situation. So I don't have a good answer for you there,
Well,
Jim.
we're certainly going to delve into the topic of climate change in the weeks ahead and spend a lot of time on this show talking about it. And we're going to bring up some data, too. To me, data is very convincing. And you have a lot of strong data that indicates there are some very disturbing trends that have been going on for the past, say, 20 years or so. And we'll get into those in future shows. On a lighter note, to wrap up, obviously, with the change in seasons, the type of precipitation changes as well. In the spring, summer, and fall, where we're pretty used to two kinds of precipitation. We're used to rain and we're used to hail. But this time of the year, we see a variety of precipitation. We saw rain the day after Thanksgiving. We see sometimes sleet. Then we hear about freezing rain. So what's the difference between sleet and freezing rain? People sometimes confuse those two.
Sure. I'm going to start with a story. 3 Decembers ago, beautiful. We could see on radar this little band of interesting looking echoes marching right into the Twin Cities from the south. It was, mid-December. And we looked on the radar and thought, oh, that looks like there might be, what is in this? It looks like it's got lightning and thunder. It looks like it's got some heavy precipitation. And then on the backside, it also looks like it has some other stuff. And when that thing hit, it actually had a loud crack of lightning, kicked it off. It started raining. The rain turned to graupel.
Which we'll talk about, yes.
And there was hail mixed in with the graupel. They both, after about a minute and a half, turned into sleet. And then another minute, 2 minutes later, it was snowing. And the thing ended with snow and brisk winds, and then it was gone. It was amazing. So we got pretty much everything. We had basically a displaced summertime thunderstorm. So the one thing it didn't have was freezing rain. So all the freezing rain is and we could probably back up a little bit, but just to start, it's just rain that freezes when it hits. So it's the same as rain that falls in the summertime, but if the air temperature is low enough, then the objects on the ground and other objects that it lands on will be frozen or below freezing, and the rain will form a glaze instantly. So that's freezing rain. Now, I could make it more complicated by saying a lot of times rain actually begins as snow way up in the cloud, and then it melts on the way down. So most of the precipitation we get actually begins as snow here in Minnesota, even in the summertime. But in any case, what we experience as rain is rain, from the cloud all the way to the ground. And the main difference between rain and freezing rain is the freezing rain just freezes when it gets to the ground. Sleet is you have that same snowflake that's falling and it begins to melt, and it melts completely into a drop of water, but then it refreezes on the way down and is frozen before it actually gets to the ground. And that provides you this nice little ball of, ice. And that's what sleet is. So sleet will melt and then refreeze before it hits the ground, freezing rain will melt completely into water and then just freeze on contact with the ground. Shall we do graupel?
Let's do it. Yes.
Yeah, so you have a snowflake that's already falling, but then you have water that sort of builds up on the snowflake as it falls. It accretes on the branches of the snowflake. Accretion is just the formation of what we call rime ice. It's just the sort of slow globulizing of this snowflake into a little pellet. And this is graupel. I believe that's a German word. It's Graupel. You know, if you want to sort of be a real weather curmudgeon, a lot of times you'll get these squalls. They look like snow. It'll rain and then it'll look like it's snowing. But if you look closely, there's none of those little branches that define snowflakes. It's just these little snowballs or snow pellets, and that's graupel. So you say, it's not snow, it's graupel. But so graupel, what's interesting about graupel is it does tend to form in somewhat convective conditions. So it's not uncommon to see graupel falling in a very shallow sort of wintertime thunderstorm, similar to the one I described a few minutes ago. And it tends to fall with squalls. So you won't see a whole day of nonstop graupel, but instead you'll see it in these 5 to 15 minute bursts most commonly here.
What about snirt?
Hey, gosh. You know what? I have to say that's not one that we picked up back when we were learning about this stuff. It goes without saying that a snowflake can form around just about any condensation nucleus. Same with a raindrop. And honestly, most frequently, the nucleus of a raindrop or of a cloud droplet or of a snowflake is some piece of dust or some aerosol. It has to form. If we had a perfectly clean atmosphere, it would be much harder to have precipitation. Snirt would be, I think I have this right. This would be the snow that forms with basically a dirt nucleus. It just sounds gross, but it's really just an oversized version of what the snowflake is anyway. I mean,
Right.
Already got some pollutant at its core, at its nucleus. Yeah, and there have been studies that have shown, over feedlots in Oklahoma, that the feedlot itself, with additional aerosols that it was producing, actually seeded precipitation overhead and downwind. And so the basically bacon-flavored snow was kind of the joke that the investigators came up with. But, there was actually snow that was falling because there had been additional things in the air because of a pig feedlot installation. So basically, if the conditions are right, you can have the precipitation form around just about any kind of aerosol. Aerosol is just, an airborne pollutant, essentially. And in some cases, those same aerosols might actually encourage the formation of precipitation.
Well, speaking of feedlots, maybe for next week, we can look into this phenomenon that some people have been reporting in the Twin Cities and the suburbs, this rather pungent aroma that is wafted around.
Yeah,
and,
why does it stink?
Yes,
about
exactly.
every year in the fall. Yeah, by the time we talk about it, people might have forgotten about it.
True.
But sure, yeah, we can give it a shot. It's an interesting one, and we certainly notice it because where I work is very near some agricultural installations, so we can.
Yeah, you're just downwind from.
We get a good whiff of that.
That's
sure.
right. Well, we'll tackle that among other issues coming up next week. Kenny, great as always to talk to you.
Always a pleasure, Jim. We'll talk to you next time.
Sounds good. See you next week on Way Over Our Heads.